Now I have the honor of welcoming a longtime friend of the Asian Pacific Fund and API Summit regular, Karthick Ramakrishnan. Karthick is a professor of public policy at the University of California, Riverside, the founder of AAPI Data, and co-founder of California 100. Karthick serves as the president of the Association of Princeton Graduate Alumni and chairs the California Commission on APIA Affairs. He also serves on the board of the California Endowment and the U.S. Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee. Ramakrishnan also founded the Center of Social Innovation at UC Riverside and the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics, an official section journal for the American Political Science Association. Karthick has published many articles, op-eds, and 7 books, and was named to the Frederick Douglass 200. He holds a BA in International Relations from Brown University and a PhD in Politics from Princeton. Now, without further ado, friend of the fund, Karthick Ramakrishnan.
Well, thank you so much. And some of you may be familiar with AAPI Data. Hopefully, most of you are familiar with AAPI Data. If you're not, hopefully you'll gain some insights from this presentation. But I'm really looking forward to the conversation that follows, that leans in not only to the data work, but also the narrative and action work. And I'm so pleased that the Asian Pacific Fund found value in that framework in helping to structure the day. They cheated a little bit. They started with narrative before the data, so it's like an NDA now rather than a DNA, but it's okay. It's okay. I also want to talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing with California 100, which is, trying to do a small thing in terms of thinking about the state's next century and how do we build more equitable, resilient, and inclusive futures for the state. Oh, there we go. I didn't realize I was not on my title slide. So many people think of me and many other academics as the data people, right? And that's true. It's important. That's where we get a lot of our credibility, and especially as we work in partnership with community. What I've been fortunate to have been part of is among a set of folks, and sadly, this is not as common as one might hope, but it is a group that is increasing, that are doing work that is grounded in social science and other scientific research, and both qualitative and quantitative, systematic research, but making sure that that research is impactful. And in the course of doing this work, I started off as just a quantitative researcher when I was doing my dissertation, and then added some qualitative components to it. Then I came to San Francisco. I still have my 415 number. I worked at the Public Policy Institute of California. That was my first job out of grad school because I wanted to do research that had impact. And I still am grateful to all that I learned at PPIC. I was already oriented in that way. So in addition to having that theater background, I was a columnist for the Daily Princetonian. Again, not something that graduate students typically do, but I've been very interested and involved in public engagement for a while. But PPIC gave me additional skills and it allowed me to hone my practice. And I'm really thrilled to try to bring that more into community, especially Asian and Pacific Islander communities, including a monthly session of public speaking classes that we're doing with leaders from throughout the country, thanks to the Wallace H. Culture Foundation. It's been a really incredible experience. Most of the folks that are part of this program, essentially we're taking the TED Masterclass, and it's a self-taught course, but we provide a supportive environment and keep people accountable to the extent that we can. There is monthly homework. We're a little lax, maybe a little too lax, Dennis, in terms of making sure people are doing their homework on time, but we're finding folks, junior people within organizations, people with very thick accents, who are just blowing past those barriers and letting their passions, their personalities, their lived experience, their personal narratives, and marrying that with their organizational missions. It's a beautiful thing to see, and we're hoping to have the chance to have a wider audience to appreciate not only the journey that our leaders have been on, but to be able to tell their story. So as you can tell, narrative is a big part of research impact. And I say this especially to research audiences. Gone are the days when, the professor was that person, on the mountaintop with the tablets or with their eureka, and of course, the truth is everywhere to see. We live in a world not only of misinformation and disinformation, but a fair amount of skepticism of all kinds, eroding trust in institutions, including government institutions and academic institutions. So what I tell my fellow academics is that, like it or not, you are in the persuasion game. You might not know it, but you are. The truth does not speak for itself, and it's important for us to take narrative seriously. It's also important for us to take action seriously, and I'll say a little bit more about that. A couple of other key points is having an orientation towards innovation. And I'll say as more and more, and thanks to Stephen Gong, I'm getting more and more personal in everything I do. So as the second child, I'm a little bit of a rule breaker. And that's part of innovation, is breaking rules, hopefully not breaking it too much, but to really question the status quo in all sorts of ways. And part of, I think, my journey and many others' journey is how do we make that innovation equitable, also respectful to tradition, but at the same time, knowing when it's time to try new things. And I think that's part of the kind of community and movement conversations we need to have that I still find sorely lacking. There was a version of that happened here a few months ago when a foundation had a particular convening. Some of that conversation is continuing, and I think for all of us in the room here, we're living in really important times in the country and the world, and especially for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. And it's important for us to lean into difficult conversations, uncomfortable conversations, and also inspiring conversations. And I say this with all of the different hats that I wear, as a professor, as a researcher, but also as the chair of the California Commission on API Affairs. So in the conversation, hopefully we can enter into a bigger conversation, but really eager, our commission is eager to make sure that we reach every single part of the state and to really introduce a new kind of energy into state policymaking and state policy implementation. We often know that making policy is one thing, it's the implementation policy that matters in some ways even more. And our communities are not as impactful as we could be. And I'm really looking forward to ways to partner to improve that looking ahead. So DNA, some of you have heard this already. I'll try to introduce a new twist so that you pay attention. But this is a lot of people, when they think API data, it's like, oh, what's the latest data, Doc? And in fact, Richard Louis calls me Dr. Data. It's almost like Dr. Doom, but Dr. Data. I'm not really sure, right? And that's good. That's good. It's flattering. And in fact, I continue to see the value and the particular expertise I bring. Just recently, been in a set of meetings with NORC at the University of Chicago. By the way, AARP and NORC have seeded an important panel of survey research. API data, thanks to our state funding, has increased that. But I'm able to be in the room where I can get really down in the weeds of sample design and weighting, right? So I recognize that data is part of my superpower, as with a bunch of other academics, and we shouldn't take that lightly. But data in and of itself is not enough. So first of all, part of the way we honed our message on this is that communities need data. Why do we fight for data disaggregation, data equity? Because we know that without data, we don't exist. Of course, we do exist, but we don't exist in the eyes of decision makers. And even if we have some kind of data, we need to have data that is systematic in order to have credibility. You're asking people to make big decisions in terms of budgets. You're asking people to make big decisions in terms of policy. They're not going to do that lightly. They have to see the evidence, right? And so you need to go beyond anecdote, the really powerful, compelling story of an elder that is experiencing a challenge, and you need to be able to show how prevalent is this problem, right? What is the scale of the problem, or what are the opportunities underway? But data in and of itself is not enough. If you don't have, data is not meaningful in and of itself. You need to have context, and it becomes more powerful when you have narrative that undergirds it. So in order for a claim to be meaningful or memorable, you're not going to forget about that buffet line, right? In whatever you do, from what you heard in the last panel. So in order for a claim to be meaningful and memorable, narrative is key. And especially when you're talking about misleading narratives, it's really important to pay attention to the power of narrative, because it can overwhelm evidence. We continue to see that every day. And then finally, all of this would just be a mere academic enterprise or a creative enterprise if we didn't think about strategic action. So all of it needs to be connected to that. So that's something that I developed at the Center for Social Innovation at UC Riverside, and then brought it in to the AAPI Data work. And if you find it useful, like the Asian Pacific Fund found it useful, go ahead and use it. We want these frameworks to actually be deployed and make a meaningful difference. So let's just drill down briefly into what each of these concepts might mean and how they may be relevant for nonprofit organizations, foundations, whoever. So first, in terms of data, a lot of times people think of data as numbers. But data, if you look at least one dictionary definition, it talks about facts. And what's interesting there, it's not just things known or assumed as facts. That's really interesting to me. So already you see the importance of perception and narrative in terms of how data are received. First of all, data or data, data are or data is. Let's just put those fights aside. We can honor our differences in terms of how we approach these things. Now, data can be anecdotal, but it's not as powerful if data is anecdotal. It's better if it's systematic. And systematic qualitative data collections are important and powerful to do, and they should not be confused with narrative, right? Qualitative data is data, it is research. The way a social science researcher approaches something is different from how a journalist approaches something. And there are strengths and limitations to each approach, and it's important to understand the difference. Data can be internal to an organization or enterprise, or external. And especially if you're doing a kind of strategy analysis, including a SWOT analysis, think about the kinds of data, both internal to your enterprise or external to your enterprise, that you need to have in order to make an informed decision. And then finally, data is useful for a variety of tasks, including making a case, thinking about program design, implementation, and evaluation. Now, in all of this, visualization is more and more important. People just don't have time to read a 20-page report. In fact, I'll just quickly do an aside. So when I was at PPIC, I remember a report that I initially worked on, and you can still see this. It's called Immigrants in City Hall, right? I think it's still on their website. Initially, it was a 200-page report, and I remember people saying, okay, no one's going to read 200 pages. You need to chop 100 pages from this thing. That was really painful to do, right? I still don't know. I mean, one of my regrets is we should have converted that into a book, right? But we made it into a 100-page report, and some of the findings are likely still true, where you see very limited language access throughout municipalities in California, very little awareness among city managers and mayors and council members in terms of where their immigrant communities live, et cetera. But that was painful, right? Going from 200 pages to 100. By the time I left PPIC, they're like, yeah, we want most reports to be 25 pages, preferably 20 pages. And by the way, most people are going to read only the 2-page summary of the thing. It's kind of depressing, right? When you're an academic with all of that work going into it. And then what we noticed by the time you get to the late, the early 2010s, is that people aren't even reading that. They're not even reading a blog post. What they're looking at is an infographic and a headline, right? That's all that most people have the attention span for. That said, you want to make sure that the research undergirding that is really solid, right? So that for people who want to dig deeper, they can understand better and also know that what you're putting out is credible. Narrative. So some key concepts on narrative. So a lot of people think of narrative as messaging. One of the books I wrote with colleagues is called Framing Immigrants. You don't need to read the whole book. You can find the first chapter PDF on the Russell Sage Foundation website. But it was really good and fascinating. So we looked at framing as it occurs in news stories and also framing as it might shift opinion in a survey experiment context. So I don't want to nerd out too much into framing theory, but also understand that narrative work is not just framing, it's also agenda setting. And agenda setting is really hard to do. Things that move agendas are decisions by the presidents of the United States, wars, natural and other human-caused disasters, mass shootings. Those all set agendas. It's really difficult for any organization, let alone a collective, to set agendas unless they can provoke some kind of consequence, right? And occasionally protest behavior can do that. But even those, it has to be coordinated and planned very well. And even then, it might not happen, right? In terms of generating the kind of public attention that you might want. Agenda setting also means to have an organization and a collective always prepared and at the ready with their framing strategies, with their supply of frames, people who can speak, who are media trained, who can speak. Reporter calls you. That's one thing for me. I get a ton of emails a day. I'm just generally, it's either I respond right away or maybe weeks later. But generally speaking, I just give my phone number out to reporters and just say, just text me. But often when reporters call you, they need to hear back within 3 or 4 hours or they've moved on. So just think about the level of preparedness you need to have in terms of not only like repeating your talking points. Most reporters are pretty savvy. A lot of times they've already written the story in their minds and they're just looking to see how you fit into their story. But if you're prepared, sometimes you feel it in the course of like a 30-minute conversation with a reporter, but you know it when you see the story and you see like, wow, I really used this opportunity to help educate this reporter, and it shifted the entire way they thought about that story. And you can see your organization's fingerprints all over that story, even if they only quoted you or not at all. So that's something to think about, right, in terms of narrative work. But in terms of framing, limited time here, we can talk about it more in the Q&A, or maybe we can do like some masterclass on framing later. But there are different ways to think about framing, from big idea framing to story framing to messaging to sound bites. And one thing about a big idea frame that's sometimes used, and I find it useful, is the successful attempt to reframe the estate tax in the 1990s into calling it the death tax, right? And so you take something that you think of like Mr. Monopoly, like these like rich people that deserved, to feel the pain, to then thinking about, wow, like even in death, I cannot escape the government's clutches, right? And that was a very effective move, and it was a pretty big move to engineer that shift. Another big idea frame is the amnesty frame. That's what we did in Framing Immigrants, is that conservatives found very effectively that no matter what the policy, if you frame it as amnesty, you will drive down support for the policy. So even something like deferred action for childhood arrivals, they were able to drive down support for it by just using the word amnesty, even though it was not an amnesty, right? The truth does not matter. These narrative strategies can be effective, and they're based on a lot of research, testing, and deployment. The deployment is key. You can do all the research you want. You need to increase the supply of those frames in circulation in order for them to stick. A lot of times you'll have consultants that will do things in controlled settings and say, wow, look at how much you can move your audience based on this. Well, no, first of all, it doesn't mean that you'll have adequate supply. Also pay attention to the opposition. They're not resting, right? They're not sitting around. We see this not only with CRT, we see this with trans rights and so many other things. This framing and persuasion happens in a competitive environment. So as much as possible, try to recreate that reality when you do that work. And then finally, our research shows that when there are gaps in information, that's when you have the greatest ability to persuade. So we found that, for example, using the word, and I will give a little warning, undocumented immigrants versus illegal immigrants. So a lot of people have been investing a lot of time and energy. We found that it actually doesn't shift that much. People know exactly who you're talking about. You're not providing any new information to the person. So like treat your audience with respect a little bit, right? But if they don't know something, you can use frames to tell your version of the story before others do, and perhaps shape their initial understanding of what happens. And then finally, action, right? Advocacy, so there's a bunch of research which shows that advocacy is more effective when it's federated. Some of those powerful organizations, from the NRA to teachers' unions, are federated. There's a national organization, state organization, and local organization. So that's something to think about, right? We might not have the same resources to be able to do it, but at least to be in federated coordination. By the way, states are not only the frontiers, they are where the action is happening on most policies these days. And our communities ignore state governments at their peril, right? It's also more effective when it's coordinated in ecosystem, grassroots and grass tops, outsider strategies, insider strategies. I'm running out of time, so I'll talk about it more in the Q&A. I'm supposed to talk about data, so I'll just say a little bit about data here. So this is what you'll see when you go to our website. Actually, I didn't update it with our latest screenshot because we have a new tool that we'll be launching today. Remember what I said about a picture and a headline being influential? So we initially put this out when the Obama administration announced the expansion of DACA and the introduction of the Deferred Action for Parents of Americans program. The Migration Policy Institute put out a map showing the number of undocumented immigrants per state by region of origin in the country. I remember seeing that. I still remember it vividly. I wake up super early, right? I work 12-hour days, right? And I start my day at like 5 in the morning. But I remember seeing that from MPI that morning, and I called my graduate assistant at the time, Sono Shah, and I said, Sono works at the Pew Research Center now, and I said, Sono, let's create some quick infographics on this. This is really interesting stuff. So we generated a bunch of infographics, and including the number of Asian undocumented in some key states around the country, and said what portion of the overall undocumented population there were, as well as what portion of the Asian immigrant population they were. This was not fancy statistics. It was basic arithmetic. But what we did was take one numerator, which is Asian undocumented, divided by the denominator of Asian foreign-born, and we came up with this headline and this factoid. This got shared. I mean, this is where community partnerships come in. This got shared so widely, so fast, that within 2 days, I had an interview on NPR Weekend Edition with Scott Simon. It was novel, right? Remember that part about new information? Most people did not think about undocumented immigrants as Asian at all. By the way, this is a problem within our community too. So many people have these false narratives in their head that, oh, we came here the right way. Most people are coming here on work visas. Neither of those is true. Well, maybe most of us came here. I don't even know what the right way is. But most Asian immigrants are not coming here on work visas. But those are the narratives, those are the myths, those are the stories that we tell ourselves or that recirculate in our communities without being challenged as they should be. And it's not only in terms of media impact. We had members of Congress using that factoid, and we knew that we had generated it. It was remarkable. Now, it's not to say that this happens every day or every month at AAPI Data. We're very lucky when things like this happen. But it's about being prepared, right? There's a famous quote by Louis Pasteur, which starts off this forward on this futures toolkit that I'll talk about if I have some time. And this is actually by Louis Pasteur, right? Chance favors the prepared mind, right? And there's a kind of other versions of it. So be prepared, right? For those windows of opportunity. It doesn't mean that you'll always succeed. Put out some data points. Please check out our website. If you go to apidata.com/reports, you'll see a report that we did in collaboration with UCLA Center for Health Policy Research and the California Health Interview Survey. This is part of the state investment in AAPI Data. We were able to increase sample sizes of Asian and Pacific Islander populations and to do some deeper analyses. And you'll see things like this, right? In terms of Asian Americans, always being able to get a doctor's appointment within 2 days. That declined significantly pre-pandemic and post, or the second year of the pandemic, I suppose, right? And the CHIS data are always about a year and a half late. We are now about to enter into a new period later this fall where we'll be, hopefully, I would say 99.99% this is going to happen, to conduct monthly surveys in language of Asian American communities and also hopefully sizable enough Pacific Islander communities. Okay, I'm going to take another 5 minutes just because I'm getting to my data points here. But you can check out our website and see some of these key findings, right? In terms of difficulties is accessing health services, you see significant barriers there. It's higher for NHPIs, but take it with caution because that's just based on 1 year of data. We have a second year of data and a report that'll come out this fall that'll have statistically reliable estimates for the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander population. We believe that it's important to get data points out with the caveats rather than suppressing that information, but other scientists might have different preferences. We also see significant differences within the population. Mental health, this is a significant issue, and maybe we can take a little bit of time during the Q&A to talk about this. Significant issue in terms of experiencing difficulties accessing mental health care. We also had questions about gun violence. This is before the most recent spate of shootings, and we find that NHPIs and Asian Americans have the highest level of concern, of worry about being a victim of gun violence. And we saw that it continued with other surveys that we've done since then. Continuing on mental health, we find that, and this was a survey that we did with Momentive/SurveyMonkey, and we found that Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are the least likely to say that they have strong support in seeking out mental health care. Important data and narrative about our community. It doesn't necessarily say what the solution should be, although in the CHIS report we found that people are more likely to seek care if they know that it's provided by someone they trust and it's like culturally competent, essentially, right? So part of that's a supply issue and also changing the way our mental health care system works. We think of hate crime and mental health as related and gun violence as related, so that's why we put them all together in a particular section of that CHIS report. Continuing on, we see in terms of hate crime victimization, a lot of people think Asians are the most likely to have experienced hate crimes. It's not true. More recently, they've been, but there are other communities that are more likely to say that they've experienced hate crimes. We also replicated, notice here, in the past we've asked about hate incidents, and there are some efforts that kind of mix up hate crimes with other kind of hate incidents, including verbal insults. We should pause and think about something like that that then brings us into equivalency with Black populations who have experienced other things that are far more violent than that, right? We found this time and again, right? And Stella, I'm so glad you say you bring your whole self in. Multiracial populations, we've found time and again most likely to say that they've been experiencing hate crimes and other types of hate incidents. We need to talk about that, especially as it affects our community. There are also important differences within our community. So if we just led with narrative, you might think most people who are experiencing violent hate crimes are elderly Asian immigrant women. It's more likely to be younger people. It's more likely to be men, right? More likely to be native born. Now, it's not to say that we should not pay attention to those other populations, but what are we doing about young men that are being victimized on account of their race? What kind of explicit gender-conscious strategy do we have? These are things that our community is not talking about enough because we're holding on to certain types of narratives and not really seeing the evidence for what it's showing us. And it's not just one survey. We've seen multiple surveys that are now showing the same thing. We also see greater reluctance in our communities in terms of reporting hate crimes to law enforcement authorities. So there's a lot of work to be done there. It's also important to know that when you look at different communities, increases in hate incidents is happening everywhere. Hopefully this can provoke a politics of solidarity rather than exceptionalism. thinking that somehow, yes, we are different in the way these things are affecting us, but we are not unique in the fact that these things are affecting us. Okay. 2 minutes. New data. So it's one thing for us to collect data and disseminate it. We think it's important to democratize data access. So launching today, it's something that's been in the works for a while. Ryan Vin built this up, and if you go to our website, you'll find this tool where you should be able to select different racial groups and different detailed origins within the Asian and the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community. Choose your level of geography, and you should be able to quickly generate tables, charts, and maps connected to that. We also did mapping connected to 2020 census outreach, and once we fought. Thank you, community members, for joining us and fighting with the Census Bureau. We love the Census Bureau, but we also know that they could do much better in terms of how quickly they put the data out. Finally, this fall, after much fighting, fall of 2023, we're going to get 2020 census disaggregated data. It's kind of insane, right? It's our data, isn't it? Like, isn't that our information? But anyway, this is where we are, and we hope to update these maps when they do come out. We're also paying attention to state policy. So in addition to being an immigration policy scholar, I'm also a scholar and nerd on federalism. And it's really important to pay attention to states and what's happening in states, both for good and for ill. So check out that state policy portal that we've created, and we're hoping to build additional capacity to build learning across states to build more inclusive policies. And this is where I'll end. So the last part is all of this stuff that we're doing right now, as a movement, we're still in reactive mode. I've been part of California 100, which is a long-term futures initiative. And part of the capability that we want to democratize is the capability for foresight. To be able to anticipate, think, plan ahead for uncertain futures and alternative futures. These are the kind of tools that the U.S. Defense Department, these tools came up during the Cold War, right? The RAND Corporation developed these tools immediately after the end of World War II to set the stage for U.S. rivalry with the Soviet Union. And then the Shell Oil Corporation continued enhancing these tools in order to ensure the dominance of big oil. In fact, if you think of who are the dominant clean energy companies these days, it includes the Human Energy Corporation. You know who the Human Energy Corporation is? Chevron. Talk about Richmond, right? Or Beyond Petroleum. It's not British Petroleum anymore. Those are the biggest players in the clean energy sector, right? So they are winning the systems of today, and they are gaming to be winners in the systems 30 years from now. But what about the rest of us? So part of what I hope that our community can start doing is not just, of course, it's important to pay attention to the challenges we face today, but to start visioning and to start creating roadmaps for the future we want to see, and to build new systems that are more aligned with our values. Happy to talk about that in whatever little time we have left. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Karthik, for the great presentation. We'd like to open up the floor for Q&A. We have volunteers in the audience running mics, so just please raise your hand. Oh, we have one in the back.
Hi, everyone. Quick question.
Oh, could you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Duatha. I'm with Serato Philanthropies. How are you doing, Karthick? My understanding is actually the U.S. Census Bureau is going to remove Hmong as an ethnic group out of the 2020 census data, which for us is pretty disturbing since it takes so much time to actually get that sub-ethnicity data. Part of the conversation today is about how we as a collective, regardless of what ethnicity you are, work on behalf of the entire community. And I think what's a little bit difficult to talk about is it's mostly the community advocating on behalf of the fact that that data is lost. Like, what's your reflection on how we as the collective can work towards more data justice across all communities? And then also, when we have something like this happens, which is pretty profound for our community, I think the response was that we'll just get that data back in 2030. which is not sufficient. What's the work that can be done now to try to, is it possible to even go in and get that data still if it wasn't collected or disaggregated?
Yeah, let's, I want to get some greater clarity here because we flagged and we worked with CIRAC and others when we first saw the Census Bureau's guidance where they had they'd started to create these regional categorizations and they had classified Hmong as East Asian and we're like, no, that's not right. And we worked with national advocates to have a meeting with the Census Bureau. I was not aware that the Hmong data are not going to be released at all. But let's talk later about that. I had seen that as a misclassification on the regional data as opposed to not releasing that data at all. But both in my capacity as AAPI Data and the Census National Advisory Committee, I'll make sure that we get to the bottom of this as quickly as we can. The data are there, so that surprises me. What's the bigger thing that's happening for small populations, and that came up a bit, right, in the prior conversation, the Census Bureau decided in the late 2010s that they were going to start implementing differential privacy protections. Congress didn't have any say in it, and what that meant is that any small population in a geographic area immediately would not be released at all, right? Because what they said is data science and big data have gotten so sophisticated that you can start personally identifying people based on census information on ethnicity in a small geographic region and then merge that with other data. My opinion and those of others is like it's kind of already happening and we're kind of losing out on the ability to serve our communities. But that's something that they've been doing with racial data and also ethnicity data at small levels of geography. But we mobilized before, and hopefully we can mobilize again. I agree with you, it's unacceptable that we need to wait till 2030 for that to happen. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
I'll just speak real loud. Hey, Karthick, Jonathan Tran. You and I have an affinity for state politics and how the legislature plays out. Unfortunately, the API Legislative Caucus and the supporters and those that help get those members elected, I hope I don't get you in trouble. The vast majority of the funds that they've raised come from labor, certainly, but we're seeing a growing number of interest groups that have targeted Asian American electeds as a vehicle to move their agenda. So lots of money coming from fossil fuels, realtors, apartment associations, folks that have been opposed to some of the racial solidarity and justice components. How do we navigate that, especially if some of our elected leaders are now funneling those messages and framing the conversation?
Yeah, no, great question, Jonathan. Part of it is I think it takes a multifaceted approach. So one of the things you might not be surprised for me to say is that I think we need to think about not only grassroots, but like increasing the supply of narratives, right? Part of that. I mean, it pains me every time. In fact, an LA Times reporter called me about a month ago, with some suburb in Los Angeles County that was like mobilizing against a homeless shelter and had a significant number of Asian Americans mobilizing against it, right? So it's not just special interests. We saw that in Irvine. We're seeing that all over the place. Now, those of us who have progressive commitments, if we do not have the vast majority of our population with us, like we are failing as leaders and we're failing as a movement, bottom line. But I think part of the failure is also organizations with funding that should be putting money into those efforts that are not, right? And so that's where we think about both public and private dollars and how they are deployed. Because that ultimately is what'll work, right? People power is what we need. Now, there are some other solutions too that I find interesting and promising, including in Oakland with the Democracy Dollars program. So what if we started democratizing campaign finance, right? Where you have every household as a donor household. You can really start evening the playing field. So those are some of the ideas we're looking at California 100. It's not lost on me that as an Asian American and as a person of color, like I'm heading up this thing that could have been led by a white male, as these things typically are. But at the same time, there's limits to even what I and others can do. And I'm really committed, and this is why when you saw Equitable Futures, like I think the next 5 years or 10 years of my work is I'm about to create an equitable futures group to really be proactive in our thinking. So not only to counteract what we're seeing now, but yeah, what is the future of California where you have housing that is so unaffordable? And even if, a lot of times we're like, yeah, we're affected by homeless too. It's like, okay, chances are, at least the Asian American community is much less affected by the homeless issue, no matter how much problems you have with how data are collected. But that does not mean that that is not in our interest to make sure that we solve homelessness in this state that is predominantly affecting Black populations. So let's be explicit about that and also understand what our common agenda and shared purpose is. So that's something I hope, right, that we can think of that both and kind of approach, that of course we care about our communities, but we fundamentally care about California, and we don't get there without racial equity.
All right. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for now. But Karthik will be sticking around, so if you have any questions, feel free to catch him at lunch.
Yeah, and folks, I'll say on some of this, so I am serious, especially about the commission. We want to make sure, unlike the Legislative Caucus, we don't represent particular districts. We are there to represent the entirety of the Asian and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander population in California. Be kind to us. We're all volunteers. We have a couple of staff. In fact, we have a search for an ED and a couple of other staff right now. But I remind our commissioners that that is their charge, right? Of course, we need to have impact and access to the governor's office and the legislature, but we are there to try to advocate for the entirety of our community in California, and to do so in a way that is solidaristic and also just plain smart. Like playing racially divisive politics, it's going to bite us in the butt. So even if you're not feeling all the feels, like, this like Rainbow Coalition, this Benetton ad, it's like, even if you just care, it's like enlightened self-interest. If all you care is about your community, is like, don't be so narrow-minded, because it will come back and bite you.
All right. Please join me in thanking Karthik again.